go. So I'm going to talk to you today. Obviously, probably the main reason for the majority of you coming here is MongoDB and large language models, which obviously we've all seen in the news as of late with OpenAI, ChatGPT, etc. So a bit of background on myself. I came to New Zealand and started working for a company that did like ERP integration. So when you think of ERPs, you've got your sort of SAPs, MyArb, Xero, and those types of things. They were working with Microsoft SQL back in the day, stored procedures and all those nice things. So I at university, I got introduced to NoSQL. So we did stuff with KHDB and Node.js and all those exciting things 10 years ago. So then I decided to go and set up my own company and basically working with, I've kind of niched down to a particular ERP system and built around that. So the reason that I decided to choose MongoDB was kind of the Atlas offering. So just for one person, it kind of enabled me to rely on, obviously, MongoDB to provision the databases and manage those types of things. And then for whatever MongoDB couldn't do, then I'd kind of rely on AWS. So one of the things that you may not know of for MongoDB is they have this thing behind the scenes called app services, which was called also Realm and also Stitch. So I've seen many revolutions of this throughout the years. So yeah, I've always kind of been early adopter of new technologies, and that kind of goes into why I'm doing this talk today. So I thought it was probably best just to go around what Atlas App Services is, because that's what the demo is kind of built around, and it manages the whole thing without me having to run any containers or any of those sorts of things. It's a simple app, but just to reiterate how good Atlas App Services is, I've had thousands of customers doing B2B orders, doing millions of dollars worth of orders, all using pretty much Atlas App Services on the back end, doing things from authentication, doing HTTPS endpoints, automation with triggers and all those types of things. And the high availability comes from the fact of you've obviously got your 3 nodes that Atlas offer. If one goes down, it comes back up again. I can kind of sit there, potentially maybe on a beach, and hope that everything goes to plan. But yeah, it's been really good over the past 4 or 5 years to help me build on top of. Probably the closest examples you could get are things like if you've ever used Firebase and AWS Amplify, those things kind of help with authentication and so like the serverless functions, storage, etc. So the main components that I use are pretty much the functions and triggers. So triggers kind of build on top of MongoDB change streams, which are awesome if you haven't used them before. So the next thing to cover, I'm just kind of building like the foundations of the understanding for you. Atlas search. So I think it was probably 18 months to 2 years ago, maybe less, maybe longer, I'm not too sure. But MongoDB kind of introduced Atlas, which kind of runs alongside the cluster, but it kind of gives you all the nice search stuff from like Lucene, and it doesn't come at any additional costs. So, I mean, if you're paying for things potentially like Algolia or some of these other third-party software as a service things, like Algolia is so expensive, and you then have to send all your data there. It's another integration, etc. Go and try MongoDB Atlas Search because it's so fast. It's pretty mind-blowing, and I know that I haven't even explored probably even 30% of it. So yeah, go and try it. And then the bottom point there, vector search. So that's what I'm pretty much talking about today. Was just announced. I think it was at MongoDB Local in New York, probably around a month ago. But before it was announced, I was accepted onto like an early access preview for that. So I kind of built some POCs, and one of the POCs is what I'm going to show you today. So what is vector search? Can anyone put their hands up and tell me what vector search is? Like, does anyone know what vector search is? Yeah, I didn't think so. And I truly potentially don't know that I do either, but I know how to use it, which is cool. It's very, it's just complex math in my basic understanding. So when you think of, say, a paragraph of text, or let's say a page of a PDF, or even an image, underlying that is obviously ones and zeros because it's a digital format. But this is a new sort of thing that I'm not sure exactly what happens, but you essentially take your data, maybe a string of text, and then you pass it to something like OpenAI's embedded model. So you can see this model here, text embedding Ada 2. And this will basically take your text and it will return 1,536 numbers, which you'll look at them and you'll be like, okay, what does that mean? Like, because to the human eye, it doesn't mean anything, but to a computer, and when you're doing the vector search, it means a lot. So the dimensions are these, it's an array of 1,536 numbers. And the way that it then works is, you can see on the screen here, you've got the X and Y axis. So all of these sorts of points kind of consider what the vector is. So you'll see the blue point on the top. What happens is when you want to ask a question, like let's say, what's the weather doing today? You then convert your question, what's the weather doing today, into a vector. And then you then go to MongoDB. Okay, here's my 1,536 numbers. What's the closest representation that you can get of those numbers? And that's what you can see from those nodes around there. They're called the nearest neighbors. So essentially the nearest neighbor is, here's my query, what's the closest thing that's around it? Probably one way that you can think of it is when you go to like an e-commerce online shop and it asks for your precise location, you put it in and it might show the 5 closest stores around you. What it's doing there is essentially just showing the 5 closest matches to your question. So in terms of loading data, you've obviously got all these different types of data that you've got sitting around. In businesses, you might have knowledge bases, you might have code repositories, you've got emails, you've got all these different types of data. And if you can turn those into vectors and then save them somewhere, it becomes quite intriguing because you can start to then make sense of that data quite quickly. So the one SDK that I've used at the moment is LangChain, which has kind of been getting quite a quick following, but it's also been getting a lot of, well, recently negative publicity for kind of how fast that it's moving, because there's so much functionality being added so quickly. Like in the AI space at the moment, it's like you wake up in the morning and someone's released a new model and everything's changed and it's like breaking news all over again. So what I've done for the demo is I've kind of got an Atlas app service thing that's going, and it's indexing data from the One News API. So I'm kind of ingesting news articles every hour on a triggered like scheduled function. And then that goes to OpenAI, embeds the data. So imagine this is One News's API, just JSON data. It then takes it in, loads it, embeds it, and then basically puts it back into MongoDB. So with the purple thing there, that's essentially MongoDB's document. Because obviously with MongoDB's like flexible schema, you can go, okay, here's all my news articles, and I'm just going to add one new field, which is the array of 1,536 numbers. So when you then go and search, you can go, okay, I want to filter down on these particular tags, but you can also go, I want to filter on this particular vector. So this is what it looks like in the end. And this is what I mean when I say when you look at it, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Because, yeah, so essentially what I did here is I said, what is happening with the weather? And that's the result that I got back from OpenAI. But then when I put that into an aggregation pipeline with search, essentially it will return really, really relevant documents out of the OneNews API that I've stored in MongoDB. So, for example, headline here, how's the weather looking for the start of the school holidays? Heavy rain, possible tornadoes, as a run of golden weather ends up north. So at this point, I've kind of done my search and I've returned relevant documents. So I'm kind of like, okay, what do I do with them next? So what we can do is then go down this route. So I've kind of explained the scheduled trigger. So that's essentially runs every hour, picks the data up. Database trigger embeds the essential OneNews article so that we can search on it later. And then we can kind of start to play with it then. So what I've built essentially is a Slack bot, which has got a bit of Kiwi humor. So what comes now is, I'll show you the demo in a minute, but the HTTPS endpoints, when a message gets sent in Slack, what will happen is the question goes back to MongoDB, and then we initiate a sort of search with that. So we have to obviously convert it into an embedding, and then we start to do the things that you might have heard around, like prompt engineering and all that exciting stuff. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of the schedule function. So I'm not sure 100% if you can see, but what we've essentially got is we've got a scheduled trigger, and it's running every hour on a cron job. Like, I don't have to do anything with this. There's no AWS involved. There's nothing else involved. This is all just running purely on Atlas App Services. And then essentially if a new document gets added to the collection, so I've got a collection called news stories. I only want to run this function if a new document's been inserted, because I only need to do it once. If you've got the description and the title, the story body, etc., it's kind of unlikely to change. And if it did, I'm not going to go down the route of handling that for a POC. So it kind of runs this function, which we've got embed OpenAI. So then, yeah, this is where we start to get into the code. So can everyone see that? Or, yeah, sweet. So one of the things we've got at the top is context values.get. So that's essentially, I don't want you guys to see my OpenAI key running up a huge bill. Next thing we do is import the packages, add all the configuration things that we need to, and then we take the full document. So the full document is essentially what I saved from the OneNews API. But to kind of make sense of that, I could just like JSON stringify the whole thing, but what I've done is kind of put the tags. So you might have things like sport and those types of things. And then I put the headline description in, and then I've also put the story in. So I basically take that string, which might be quite big, and then send it to OpenAI and do the embedding. So within this variable here, embedding, that's where we've got 1,536 numbers. And that then gets saved here. Yeah, so it basically updates it. Well, it doesn't upsert, you can't see the thing. And yeah, just puts the embedding value on. So then the next thing, now that we've got all our news stories and things in MongoDB, it's just sitting there, it runs along every hour. It will just continue to go for, well, until OneNews API shuts me down, or shuts MongoDB down from requesting from their own service. But essentially, what we need to do now is Slackbot comes in and asks a question. So we can, I'm using change streams again here, because with Slack's bots, you have to respond in 3 seconds. Now, OpenAI doesn't tend to respond in 3 seconds, so I just thought of another way around it to use change streams again. So what I do initially is you can call another function quite easily within here. That's another Atlas App Services function. So I just send back to the user instantly, look, we've received your question. And then we kind of go through that same business again. We need to take the user's question and put it into an embedding. Because if we remember back to that chart where it was like those 5 neighbors, we need to find the closest matches that we've got. So this is where the magic happens, and this is kind of what MongoDB have just released with the vector search. So we've got this new operator at the top, which is called KNN beta, and we can put our vector in there. And I've specified that I want three documents to return. So within those 3 documents, I essentially want URL, description, headline, publish date, tags, story. I don't want the vector because at this, now it's useless to me because I've only needed it for the search. And then we basically come down, get our story results, and then we've kind of redo what we did when we created the vector. So, you know, I want to get from our data the headline, tags, date, and story. So now we're kind of ready to go. Okay, we want to put that into ChatGPT. So this is one of the important things when you're working with these large language models, that you really kind of have to tell them what they need to do. Otherwise, they can kind of just go off and do what they wanted. So without this system prompt here, it wouldn't know that it was related to New Zealand news articles potentially. And it wouldn't know to add in a bit of Kiwi humor into the responses. So within this, some of you guys might have seen this before. If not, we're basically selecting the model that we want to target here. So GPT 3.5 Turbo is what pretty much everyone, I assume, might have used here. And that's essentially ChatGPT's underlying model for the free sort of tier. But if you wanted to go like another level and start doing more advanced reasoning, you'd be looking at GPT-4. But that's a lot more expensive and it might take longer. One of the other things to look at here is temperature. So probably the best example that I've got a temperature is a temperature of 0 is likely to be something like an accountant. It's going to be very much, it's going to stay in its lane and do what it's told. It's not going to veer out of there. And a temperature of 1 might be an incredible artist because they've stepped outside their box. They've been completely creative. And they're kind of looking not so much at the clear path, they're kind of diverging and bouncing around. So once we've got that response back from OpenAI, we then also take the URLs that we had earlier, and you'll see why. And then we just send the message back to the user. And that's pretty much it. It's quite crazy in how like little code you can kind of just create something from that. So that like I'll load it up in a minute, but this is just one example. So all I've done is just asked a question, what has happened in sport? That was probably a couple of weeks ago. And I think there was some controversy around the sort of test match between Australia and England, where they kind of, you know, just got him out quite easy and it was a bit controversial. But it's just crazy how it can come back with that. But it's because we've given it the context that it lacks, because the large language model of OpenAI was trained up to 2021. So it doesn't know anything about the Ashes match that happened like the other week. So yeah, let's give it a bash. Has anyone got a question that we would like to ask it? Or shall I just ask one? What was that, sorry? I think in the embed, I think I picked the first 1,000 characters just because you've got to deal with like context, like token limits and things. I've got that in another slide to talk about just when you think about tokens to talk about just when you think about tokens and things. Has anyone got a question, or should I just go for? Okay. Let's say last 2 weeks, because I added in some. So what's essentially going to happen now? Like, I've got a little webhook thing. This will go off. So that was our first sort of function that ran. It was like, oh, because I want to respond straight away back to the user to be like, you know, we've received your question. Then it might take 8 to 10 seconds. So what it's basically said is, so I'll just leave you all to read it because, yeah. So yeah, like I could never have come up with that quickly. Obviously, like it would take me hours to come up with that. For one, to find the right news articles, because there's thousands of news articles that are sitting in there. But it's also just to come up with a bit of humor. Does anyone get any more questions that they want to give it? Oh, I don't know if I'll know that, to be honest. With what we could do though is, like, hopefully this will solidify our prompt to say, look, I don't know anything. So it still returned the things because obviously it still found some things, but yeah. And that, in my opinion, that's a good response because we don't want it to lie about things. So yeah. I'm not sure why these results, but apparently those are the closest matches to that question. Yeah, so maybe MongoDB is just a gang of people. It's all gangs. Like, anyone got one last question for me to give it a bash? Nope. Or, okay, we'll see that. But then it's taught on American information. Maybe, I don't know. We'll see. Who's going to win the rugby? You never know what kind of tricks they're asleep. So yeah, like, I mean, this is obviously a super fun project, but I'll just show you one other thing that I've kind of built that's helping me at the moment, which is actually more of a sort of business use case that is relevant. So I work with an ERP system, Accredo. You probably never heard of it, but it's quite a specialized sort of ERP system in New Zealand and Australia. But I don't know 100% behind the scenes how it works that well, but I obviously understand how the API works. So I can come in, and because I've indexed all the documentation that sits behind it, I can then ask some sort of questions to be like, explain how I can find out of stocks. So I don't know in the ERP system at this point of how to do it, but because I've indexed all the information, I can pass all of that information into OpenAI, so it can make sense of these bricks of text because it found the closest match. So yeah, so that's super helpful. And because it's good at writing code, you give it the sort of specifications around the OData endpoints and things. It will then start writing code for you. So I mean, I've wrote some bots to literally go and write code for me to improve my SDK that I've got open source just for this particular ERP system and things. So yeah, that's an actual business use case. The POC was just a fun thing. But yeah, so some of the key considerations when you're thinking about working with these OpenAI large language models, you could even be looking at local models like Llama and these types of things. Is the embeddings, like you kind of, if you're going to be doing the way that I've done things, you have to use those. You have to get your data into these numbers to be able to search upon them. One of the other things, which is I think what you touched on earlier, is like, are you passing it the whole story? Because you kind of limited to the amount of information that you can pass the large language models, and that's increasing honestly every couple of months. So yeah, you have to kind of think about how much data you're putting in. And going back to Atlas Search, you should try it if you haven't used it. If you're using other search providers, I'd really recommend just building a POC to see how fast it is, and you don't have to re-index your data out to another third-party provider. Another thing, app services. I've been using it for ages. I've got thousands of customers that are using my software to place orders and things, and it works really well. One thing I found on Twitter was this image that's on the right-hand side. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but it kind of gives a really good representation of, you know, that first thing. You've got your private business or personal information. If you've got it over 10 different systems, it's like you have to go into search and all of those things. But if you can kind of vectorize it and put it in, it becomes really, really powerful, because you can start to bring different data sources together. And then that's just another good image down the bottom of the nearest neighbors and things. One thing, like I did this presentation probably, I don't know, last month or whatever it was. OpenAI released another thing which is called OpenAI functions. So I just had to play around with that. It's super, super powerful. So, I mean, I just copy and pasted this bit of text down the bottom here. But you could imagine this could be an automated script going out and collecting information. And I've essentially said, look, this is a schema that I want this data in. You'll see like here, 3.2. In there, it doesn't say anything about a rating. It does here with reviews and things like that. But that was the output that it gave. You could just put that potentially straight into MongoDB if you've got a schema around that. So in terms of if you've got lots of data sitting in silos and things, and you need to get it into a nicer format, you should look at doing this. And here's just something cool that I created with Stable Diffusion, because it's cool. So yeah, that's pretty much a demo and everything. Yeah, at the bottom, if your company's interested in what you said and stuff, just happy to talk and reach out to me. You can get my LinkedIn via Ironman. So yeah, has anyone got any questions? To embed or? So I mean, yeah, cool. So the question is essentially, obviously I showed the one news sort of thing happening on a 1 hourly schedule. The question is if you had a real-time streaming platform of data that was flying through, like, could you embed that in real time and make sense of it and then query it and those types of things? Probably the answer to that question is, how much money have you got to embed those things in real time? Because it's possible. You could be embedding logs in real time, and you don't have to potentially use OpenAI to do that. You could have your own infrastructure to do the embeddings and then search on those embeddings. So you could potentially search on those logs and all that sort of data happening, maybe fraud related things. You could search on that in real time, as long as you're embedding in real time and kind of flagging that way. But when it comes to using like ChatGPT's API and things to do some of the chat stuff, you might be limited in the capacity that they're allowing to you as a customer. But yeah, I mean, what I believe will happen is businesses will start to do all their own. Well, OpenAI is so cheap for embeddings, and I think they just reduced the cost by like maybe 75% a few weeks ago. It's so cheap to embed. I think everyone will start to embed like pretty much every useful bit of data. So everything from product descriptions to just anything, images and things like that. Because if someone uploads an image of a piece of food and they want to get a related thing to that, then they can kind of, it will have a sensible vector that kind of finds that type of thing. Any more questions? So the question was, what do I think about data privacy? It's super important, obviously. That's the first thing. One of the things with things like OpenAI, I believe that if you're using the API to kind of give inputs and outputs, then everything is kind of kept confidential and they don't use any of that for training material. But yeah, we'll see how that goes because it's such a fast moving pace. It's kind of hard to tell. I know there's a lot of things happening in the US and Europe at the moment to kind of delve into these companies and see what the hell has actually just happened. Because I think it's probably about 7 to 8 months ago that ChatGPT got released. And me personally, I'm using it every day to help me program and reason and to just make my life a lot easier. But on the flip side of that, you've got this exciting thing that's going on with all these open source models of things like Llama and these other models. Like Meta just released Llama 2 today, which is a new improved model with a 4K context length. So the 4K context length essentially means you can send through more information in your query. So you might be able to embed 5 news articles rather than 3 or yeah, so, but you could essentially be running all of these Llama, all this Llama infrastructure within your like VPC or all those types of things. So the data is never actually leaving the company. So yeah, how am I doing for time? So any more questions or? So, I mean, I haven't so much compared the speed yet, but like the one thing that I would say is when you're thinking about the difference of like, let's say I want to make a lasagna tonight. What's going to happen in that is you're going to search a food website and it's going to return lasagna probably, but it's not going to return you the core ingredients of beef, carrot, onions, and all those types of things because there's no word in lasagna that says carrots or onions.